Have you ever shared something online and for the most part you get a lot of positive feedback? You get a lot of likes, you get a lot of comments telling you that, what you shared was interesting or valid or that a lot of people agree with you. And then you get this one comment that is kind of negative or maybe very negative, right? And it seems like this one negative comment can totally make all of the positive feedback that you've gotten invalid. If you've ever wondered why that is, let me tell you. The primary purpose of the ego is to protect us from danger, right? And so when someone leaves us a negative comment or says a negative thing to us in real life, it doesn't even have to be on a post, it's quite easy to fixate on that negative thing because to our egos, that negative thing is a threat, right? So despite the amount of positive feedback that we get, despite how we might have a bevy of people on our side or who are in agreement with us or who, find value in what we have to share, there's no threat in that, right? There's no threat in being agreed with. There's no threat in having positive feedback. But when you get negative feedback or when you, are threatened in the sense that you have someone out there who feels like what you say isn't valid or isn't important or isn't meaningful, then I think the reason why we fixate on that is because to our egos, that's dangerous. To our egos, that's a potential of being ostracized from the group, right? So much of the human condition is the product of thousands of years of conditioning. And even though modern conveniences make living solo quite accessible these days, once upon a time, if we were ostracized from the group or kicked out of the group or even got, in the bad graces of the leader of the group, that could have meant certain death for us. And because of this, there's this biological wiring in our brain where we don't really want to offend people, right? We don't really want to be disagreed with because there's a part of our brains that says, well, if the group disagrees with us, then we're going to die, which is quite dramatic. But I mean, again, it makes sense if you think about how our ancestors had to live. Like, there was so much dependency on the group that if you weren't a part of the group, then you probably weren't going to survive. And I think within each of our egos, a part of that still exists within there somewhere. I'm a very solo kind of person, but I can admit that human beings are social creatures and that being social is an integral part of what it means to be human, right? And so even when you enjoy solitude or prefer solitude, quite like myself, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're okay with not being accepted by the group. And it certainly doesn't mean that it won't bother you when you get negative feedback from the group, right? The ego is inherently insecure, and that goes for every ego, including my own ego. And the reason why the ego is so insecure is because its very existence is dependent on this sense of separation, right? This sense of being apart from everything else. And being apart from everything else means that danger is always present, right? And so since danger is always present to the ego can't help but feel insecure. The ego can't help but to be hypervigilant for dangers in the environment. And this is why our egos are so good at feeling threatened even when there's not really a threat there. So like this random person on Instagram says something negative about your post isn't really going to affect you in any real negative way, right? But because our egos are so finely tuned to be receptive to threats, it's going to feel like, this random guy on Instagram can really hurt you, even though he really can. Even though someone having a negative thought about you or anything else really doesn't amount to very much at all in the grand scheme of things, I think our ego makes it seem so very often. I think the ego is one of the most misunderstood things in all of existence. Like, so many people think ego is just something that, arises when we have this inflated sense of self, or if we think too highly of ourselves, or if we have low self-awareness, right? The ego can also flare up when we have low self-esteem. Ego can also be a reason why we don't believe in ourselves, or we don't think highly enough about ourselves. Because again, what ego is ultimately is this mechanism that is meant to keep us safe, right? This mechanism that is meant to protect us from any outside danger. And sometimes the ego does that by like puffing ourselves up, right? Like making ourselves big to kind of scare off other predators in the environment. Sometimes it does that by doing the opposite, by shrinking, right? To make ourselves so small that hopefully no predators in the environment can see us. Other times it makes us freeze. It makes us, not be able to act at all and sort of play dead so that anything in the environment won't notice us, right? I think a lot of people, you see that often with people on social media who just lurk. They never post, they just watch because they don't want to be seen, because being seen feels too dangerous. And that's ego as well, right? Ego isn't always being boisterous. Sometimes ego can be the quite opposite. It can be being timid. So how do we sort of reel the ego in? How do we sort of tame or temper the ego so that it's not so reactive to what it perceives to be threats? And I think the first step to achieving this is to befriend the ego, right? To not see the ego as an enemy, to not see the ego as this error or this incorrect part of existence, because it's not that at all. It would be very hard to survive out here without an ego. I think especially in the spiritual community, this idea of killing the ego means getting rid of the ego, which in my experience, that's not what happens at all. What happens is that we sort of stop identifying with the ego. We sort of stop living through the ego, right? We sort of take a step back to the reality of what we actually are, which is awareness. And we allow that awareness to see the ego for what it actually is, which is a tool, right? A tool for us to be in the world without being taken advantage of, without, falling into traps or becoming so vulnerable that we allow ourselves to be harmed when it's not necessary. So if we can take a step back and be the awareness that witnesses the ego instead of the ego itself, I think that in and of itself sort of tempers the ego, because we no longer feel like we're the ones being threatened when a threat appears, right? The ego is sort of like a guard dog, a good guard dog. A guard dog that is your best friend, or that can be your best friend. But you have to train this dog, and you train this dog by gaining the awareness that not everything that can hit you can harm you, right? Not everything that can, say something threatening to you can actually do damage to you. I liken it to like if you've ever been around a wild toddler who just runs around hitting everything, right? If a toddler came over and hit you under your leg as hard as it could, an inappropriate response would be kicking that toddler or smacking that toddler across the face. That would be a totally disproportionate response to being hit by a toddler. And the reason why is because that toddler can't actually hurt you, right? No matter how hard it hits you, no matter how much anger and vitriol and malice is behind its intention when it hits you, it just doesn't have the capacity to truly hurt you. And I think the same is true for trolls on the internet, right? It's like they can say the meanest things, right? They can say the meanest things, they can act with the cruelest intentions. But since these people don't know you, and since they probably don't know where you live, you don't know where they live, they don't really have access to physically harming you. And, at a certain point, they no longer have access to mentally harming us once we realize that usually what people say on the internet is projections. Then the threat is no longer such a big deal. Then we can sort of tell the ego, like, hey, I know this looks like a threat. I know he or she sounds like a big bad wolf, but in reality, they're just a scared little lamb. Like they really can't hurt us. And I think when we start living with that awareness, right, of seeing what is actually a threat and what just appears to be a threat, then getting those little negative comments are no longer such a big deal that we feel the need to react to them. A lot of people assume that self-mastery means having the best ego, to have the prettiest ego, right? But in my opinion, self-mastery is transcending the ego, right? Again, like getting beyond the biological urges, the biological desires that are rooted in the ego, that are rooted in survival. Like transcending that, ascending and rising above, those baseline desires and identifying with something that is much broader, something that is much more vast, something that is much more secure than ego, and that is spirit. And I can speak for myself. Once I started identifying more with my spirit, more with soul than ego, what people said about me or think about me or feel about me doesn't really matter anymore, because ultimately I know who I am inside, and that's what matters to me the most. So I hope you got some value out of this video. I had to record this on my phone because, of course, I forgot my SD card, so that's why the framing is a bit different. But nonetheless, I hope that the message landed, and until we meet again, peace.